So, Jacob, who are you and what do you do?
Hi, I'm Jacob Little. I lead diversity and inclusion as well as people experience and talent acquisition at Glassdoor.
Now, tell us, how did you get into HR? It looks like you've had quite a career journey through this HR process, and I'd love to have an understanding of how you got your foot into the door and started making progress there.
Yeah, my first job out of college was working at a boutique consulting firm. And that's when I really started doing experiential learning, facilitation, team building. And that job got me my foot in the door at my first company, Walmart, doing leadership development. And I facilitated and was certified in personality assessments, different leadership curriculum, and I was facilitating 3 or 4 times a day, just really building that muscle. And then I spent 6 years at Walmart and took on different functions, talent management, organizational development, and got to lead teams of talent development professionals. Then at Levi's, I got to lead organizational effectiveness, really working on org models, org design, change management across a retail fleet. And then a subcurrent throughout my entire career has been involvement with employee resource groups. And I got involved with them because I was raised in a very conservative, fundamentalist Christian environment. My parents were missionaries and we moved all over the world when I was little. And they were, trying to make converts. And it wasn't a safe space for me to come out as a gay boy and a gay man. And I spent much of my early adult life trying to not be gay. And I checked myself into conversion therapy for 3 years. I converted to Catholicism at one point, and it wasn't until I went to an ERG meeting at Walmart that I tasted what true acceptance felt like, and it was a wonderful feeling. And so 4 years later, I was elected to be the head of Walmart Pride and helped take the company from a 40% on the corporate equality index to 100%, which really gave me a perspective of how elevating the employee voice and sort of corporate activism led by grassroots employees can make change. And over the course of many years, myself and many other co-conspirators with me, we changed the trajectory of the largest company in the world. And it was really thrilling and empowering, and gave me a passion for ERG work and D&I work. When I went to Levi's, which has an incredible track record and reputation of supporting LGBT employees, particularly through the AIDS epidemic, I found that they did not have a diversity program or an ERG program. And so I became friends with their newly hired head of diversity and helped him put together a D&I strategy and an ERG program. And then I took over as the leader of the LGBT ERG at Levi's for several years. And then at Glassdoor, I was hired to be the director of learning and development. And Glassdoor also did not have a D&I program. And when I got to Glassdoor, I found that everyone wanted to talk about D&I way more than they wanted to talk about L&D. And so I sort of found myself as the de facto D&I leader at Glassdoor and sort of added it to my job responsibilities and put together a D&I strategy and foundation, and started the ERG program at Glassdoor. And then during the summer, with all the social unrest and the murder of George Floyd, the foundation that we built became a really helpful tool to rapidly scale and ramp up our D&I program, not just within the people team and ERGs, but a D&I program that had an impact on our marketing campaigns and our product offerings, and really created transformational cultural change and sort of changed the identity of Glassdoor to an organization that can support underserved and underrepresented job seekers far better than it had in the past. And so we're on a really rapidly growing trajectory, and we've come a long way, and we still have a very, very long way to go. But I'm super proud of everything that we've accomplished and the intentions that we have for the future. We're just getting started.
Wow, what a great story.
Yeah.
And for many of the people who are watching, they're HR professionals looking to start their first D&I program at their company and get more into that career path. So can you talk a little bit about all these D&I programs that you were able to lead and the obstacles that you had to go through when getting those pushed forward and installing them at companies?
Yeah. So I think about a diversity strategy in sort of three tiers. And I encourage companies who are just starting on this journey to start with equity in mind. Equity is really the foundation that allows you to create a diverse and inclusive culture. And one of the cornerstones of an equity strategy is first having really good data on employees. And we found that it was really difficult to make progress when we didn't have accurate data about the demographics and the self-identifying factors of our employee population. And so we had to really rethink how we collected data, how we stored it, how we interpreted data. And we spent a lot of time on getting the demographic fields just right. So for example, a lot of companies, when they collect demographic data, there's a list of options and then other. And we got a lot of feedback from our underrepresented employees that that word other feels othering. And that if you are an other, it's not a good feeling when you check that other box. So for us, really building relationships with and getting feedback from the very people that we were trying to support with our D&I program was really important to us. So instead of using other, for example, on a gender list, we would have male, female, gender non-binary, non-conforming. And then instead of other, we would say a gender identity that is not listed. And you see how that feels very different than just saying other. So we spent a lot of time on demographics and how we collected it. Then we really focused on getting our employees to voluntarily self-identify. A lot of organizations do something called visual ID, which is, if you look Black, or if you look Asian, or if you look Latinx or Hispanic, you're labeled as such. Or if you have a last name that appears to be of a certain race or ethnicity, sometimes that system can label you as such. And so for us, it was really important that all employees can self-identify. So once we had all that information, we could get accurate metrics on our employee population. We could see how many different types of people were at each level. We could see really where the problems were. We could look at promotion rates by demographic group. We could look at time to promote by demographic group. We could look at hiring metrics by demographic group. And that really allowed us to pinpoint where our inequities were. So once we have solid data, then we can start to develop strategies to address those inequities. Another piece of equity is inclusive policies and processes. I find that most HR processes are a whole lot of words on a page to allow leaders to do whatever they want, to promote whoever they want, to develop whoever they want, to fire whoever they want. And an important part of an equitable program or process is objective criteria that are used to make decisions. So we spend a lot of time building objective criteria, universal competency maps, to really eliminate bias and allow us to do equitable processes. Healthcare plans. A lot of healthcare plans don't include good options for transgender healthcare. And if they do, a lot of times those transgender healthcare plans are designed without any input from trans people. So again, building relationships with the people that you're trying to serve is critical. Don't assume that a non-trans person or a cis person will know what's best for a trans healthcare policy. So all these are foundations of equity. Then we move on to inclusion. And we move on to inclusion first, because if you focus on diversity without having an inclusive culture for them to come into, they will leave. And that's exactly what our data showed. Underrepresented employees were leaving at faster rates than their white or non-diverse counterparts. And so how do you create an inclusive culture? You have to come at it from all angles. ERGs are a huge way to build an inclusive culture. ERGs provide community. They create educational events. They hold executives accountable for living up to the commitments they make. They represent the needs of their community. So ERGs are a huge piece of our strategy, and they've done incredible work. We redesigned all of our learning and development programs to really highlight that inclusive leadership and the ability to have sensitive, nuanced conversations about privilege and race and gender is a core and non-negotiable manager skill set in 2021. So we redesigned all of our L&D programs. We rethought our promotion process to make sure that we're promoting people equitably and that we're making decisions in the right way. And then finally, we can focus on diversity. Once we have equity in our systems, processes, and data, once we have an inclusive culture and we're training people in the skills needed to foster and create inclusive cultures, then we focus on bringing in diverse talent into the organization and making them feel welcome and that they belong. And we have a whole portfolio of recruiting strategies that we use. So for example, instead of just opening a job rec on LinkedIn and Glassdoor and Indeed, whenever we have it ready, we do intentional sourcing for at least a week before we post it. Because we know that when we post something, 90% of our applicants are going to be white. And so we have to go to the underserved, underrepresented talent who don't have the knowledge or the access or face barriers to employment that majority job seekers don't. So we source intentionally for a week for underrepresented candidates. So we fill our pipeline with amazing underrepresented talent before we open it. And then we focus on creating equity at each stage in the recruiting funnel. We implement things like the Rooney Rule, where our final slate must have at least one, preferably two or three underrepresented candidates. And then we use objective criteria with an equitable process to make the best decision for our business. Or if one of our leaders leaves, rather than just tapping an internal person to fill that position, we make that any internal candidate compete with external candidates so that we truly make the best decision for the business and we're not perpetuating systems of inequity that advantage the people who already have the most privilege and access to opportunity. So those are that's how I think of a D&I strategy: equity, inclusion, diversity, and some of the key pillars of our strategy in each of those areas.
Wow, that was very insightful. And one of the big topics that you touched upon was the importance of data and collecting the right data on employees, and also just a lot of different strategies that you have to implement to ensure that you're hiring the right people, that whether you have benefits that need to get put in place and you're having the right conversations around that. Now, when it comes to the future of DEI, what does that look like to you? And it feels like that we're just at the beginning of this movement where companies are beginning to see this as an important thing that they need to take into consideration. But something that you said is that oftentimes that HR could just be a bunch of words on a paper to basically help the employer get what they want. And we want to make sure that that's not the case at the end of the day. And how do we ensure that the future of DEI doesn't go along that route? And what does the future look like at this point?
Yeah, a really interesting question, and it's a layered, nuanced answer. I think I'm going to use a roundabout example to illustrate how I think about the future of D&I. Back in the mid 1900s, 50s, 60s, there were four major retailers, and I can't list them all off the top of my head, but there was like Dayton Hudson, Sears, and a couple others. As you know, retail has evolved a lot over the last 80 years. And um, when Walmart came onto the scene, they were a disruptive innovator because they could offer brands that only big city folks had access to. They could offer those in rural areas. So they provided more access to brands um, across the company or across the country. And these other retailers were not equipped to do so. And so all these other retailers, they tried to evolve their existing business model to compete with Walmart. And none of them were successful, except one. The only one that was successful was Dayton Hudson. And the way they were successful is that they created an entirely separate business with an entirely new business model to compete with Walmart's. And the goal of that new business they created was to kill off Dayton Hudson. Do you know the name of the company that they started to kill themselves off?
Oh, I don't. Yeah, curious.
Target.
Makes sense.
So Dayton Hudson created an entirely separate division called Target with a new business model. The goal of Target was to be so successful that they killed off Dayton Hudson. And that's actually how it worked. And the reason I tell that story is because too often, when we're faced with seismic disruptive change in our world or in our industry, we think that we can catch up by evolving the status quo with incremental change. And my theory is that when there's so much change, when we're at so many different inflection points, incremental evolution does not solve the problem and will not solve the problem. And I think too many companies, when they think about D&I, first of all, they think about it way too late, and they think about it far too narrowly and far too shallowly. And they try to evolve an entirely outdated, broken status quo, and that will never be successful. And my approach has been, and I think the approach of many progressive D&I leaders has been to dismantle systems, processes, businesses, organizations that have inequity baked into its very core and its very DNA. And so, at Glassdoor, we didn't just evolve our promotion process. We rebuilt it from scratch. We didn't just evolve our data collection process. We rebuilt it from scratch. And I think D&I programs that are truly successful in the long run and that will have the biggest impact recognize that there's a lot that we have to get rid of. There's a lot that we have to unlearn. We have to go back to the very core of our business, the core of our processes, and rebuild them from scratch. Because we are living and operating in a world that has massive wounds from a 300 or 400-year-old scar across our history. And we're trying to right the wrongs of history. And we can't do that when we're operating from structures, from assumptions, from mindsets and thought processes that are rooted in that broken, unequitable narrative. We have to write a new narrative from scratch and rebuild. So the time is not, the times are not calling us to iterate and evolve. The times are calling us to dismantle, rethink, and rebuild a new world, the kind of world that we want to live in, the kind of world that gives equal opportunity to all.
And I really appreciate you covering the many different aspects there. There's one of the things I really want to touch upon is the career path for someone that's looking to understand more about diversity and inclusion. And they're at this point where like, hey, this is interesting. I want to get into this and I want to push this initiative forward, but maybe I don't have all the skills necessary to do that. Maybe I need more experience. And what does that career path look like for what should they be learning and maybe tasks or responsibilities they should look to take on so they can feel comfortable stepping into that role at their company?
Yep. I think first and foremost, D&I leaders are change agents. We are the disruptive innovators in our companies. We are the challengers of the status quo. We are the consensus builders. We are the awakeners. We are the co-conspirators, and we rally people around our cause. And so a great skill, one of the most valuable skills that I learned in my career, even before I got into D&I, was the skill of change management. And there are lots of different change management methodologies out there. I happen to be proficient in accelerated implementation methodology as well as ProSci change management methodology, but get one of these change management certifications, go through a change management course, learn what it takes to be a change agent, learn how to garner champions and sponsors, learn how to tailor your messaging to the different constituencies that you're targeting. That is a critical skill set. Without the ability to lead and manage change, it's very difficult to be an effective D&I practitioner. Second, without deep, meaningful, trusting relationships with the communities that you're trying to support, you cannot be effective. Particularly for people like me, who are, like, I am a cisgendered white man. And imagine if I did not have the trust and support and credibility of the Black community at Glassdoor, or the Latinx community, or the LGBT community. Like, in order for me to do my job with any credibility, I have to have the trust and credibility and support of those communities. So the ability to build credibility, storytell, maintain relationships, project manage and hold to timelines, communicate updates, etc. Very difficult to be effective. D&I work has a very particular vocabulary, and so you have to learn to speak that language. The language of systemic injustice, of critical race theory, of the issues that confront each of our disadvantaged or underrepresented communities. Learning language is critical. And then self-care and boundaries. Being a change agent is difficult. It is emotionally exhausting, particularly when you're dealing with really sensitive, personal, complex issues of identity. You are confronting people in their most sensitive areas sometimes. And it is challenging work, and there's always pushback, there's always resistance, and there's always more work to do. So without really good self-care practices and boundary setting, D&I practitioners can easily get burned out and lose steam and momentum. So those are some of the key skills that come to mind.
And thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's been such a great conversation listening to you. You've shared so many insights. Before we go, I wanted to make sure if there's anything that you feel like you haven't shared that you feel like would help people who are particularly in HR looking to step into this role and be successful in it, before we go.
Yes, there's a million there's a million things we could discuss. You know, I presume I'm speaking to an audience of people who want to get into D&I, and I will tell you that it is incredibly meaningful, important work. It is also very challenging work, as I alluded to earlier. I think one of the most important things in this work, and one of the most difficult things to maintain, is senior leadership, sponsorship, championship, and support, particularly for the long run. And there, in my experience, there are sort of different phases of a D&I movement that companies go through. And the first phase is really like getting started, figuring out what we stand for, maybe setting up some ERGs, setting some D&I goals. And that phase is often the easiest because it can be performative. The CEO might read a statement, a D&I statement, or the company might release a blog saying that they're committed to D&I and spin up some ERGs. And there may be some ERG events that all the senior executives go to, and it's a big rah-rah moment. Or you do a marketing campaign featuring some people of color. Those are all like relatively easy things to do that don't require a complete reinvention of the business. It's the later phases when you change the promotion process, for example, and leaders can't just promote their favorite people anymore. And they have to have objective criteria. And they have to make sure that underrepresented people are included in the final slate. And they have to make the decision best for the business, not the person that they like the most. That requires them to give up elements of their personal privilege or to recognize their privilege. So changes like that require sacrifice, that require additional effort, that sometimes require additional expenses. That is when a D&I strategy gets hard. And that is when it's easy to lose support from senior executives. And there is a factor in this work where the goals of a capitalist society and the goals of a truly equitable society might clash. And I think for far too long, we have only prioritized growth, profits, increase in market share, and we haven't focused on long-term sustainability. We haven't focused on equity. We haven't made efforts to solve systemic issues and challenges in our society. And we've ignored that at the behest of profits and capitalism. And it's so easy for those two to be in conflict. And it is a visionary leader who can see that the two actually go hand in hand. And that if you're willing to play the long game and make the investments, that an equitable, inclusive, and diverse company, organization, and society is far more profitable in the long term, far more beneficial, far healthier, far more sustainable than the alternative. And helping your leaders recognize that is a journey and a challenge. But those that do, it sets your organization up to be a powerhouse for the long term.
Jacob, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. And I want to thank everybody for watching this video. And it's been quite a pleasure listening to you and all your insights and all your experience on diversity and inclusion initiatives and being an actual change maker and some of the cool things that you've been able to work on and really push through. I think it's quite inspiring for a lot of people to hear your story. And I think they admire and want to be in that position one day where they can do a lot of similar programs for their companies and be able to make a lot of the impact that you have made. And I hope that many of the people watching this video get to go on to do that. And again, very excited. I think it's been quite a pleasure hearing you, and I wish you the best moving forward with everything that you're working on. And we're gonna go ahead and rock and roll from here.
Awesome. Great to speak with you, Joshua. Good luck, everyone. Bye-bye.